I'm Wanda Sobieski, and I'm interviewing John Leonard Sobieski Jr. for the Knoxville Bar Association History Project. Would you state your full name and your birthday, please?
John L. Sobieski Jr., and my date of birth is November 15th, 1945.
And where were you born?
I was born in Chicago and spent very much of my life there. I went to parochial grammar school, Immaculate Conception in the city of Chicago. And then I went to St. Patrick High School, also in the city of Chicago.
Were those all boys' schools?
Grammar school was not, but my high school was an all-boys high school, and there was an all-girls high school that was about 2 blocks away. And then for college, I went to Loyola University of Chicago, which has gotten a little bit of notoriety lately because of Sister Jean and the success that the Loyola Ramblers basketball team has had in the NCAA tournament. And so all my education was in parochial schools in the Chicago area. And the first time I ever went to an educational institution of a different sort is when I went to law school, and I went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor.
Okay, well, before we get there, Sobieski sounds like a Polish name.
It is, very much so.
Can you tell me a little bit about your family, how they wound up in Chicago?
Well, my grandparents were the first generation to come to this country. The Sobieski side of the family, ironically, was half German and half Polish. And so my German grandmother was a seamstress, and my German grandfather was a tailor. And then the other side of the family, my mother's side of the family, were named Malik, and they were completely Polish, entirely Polish. And my grandfather ran a tavern, and my grandmother cleaned office buildings at night. And she never learned to speak English, except for a few phrases here and there. My German grandmother, on the other hand, spoke German. She learned Polish. She could speak English. Both my grandfathers died when I was an infant, so I really didn't know either one of them. But I did know my grandmothers.
Okay. And so tell me, when did you decide to go to college?
My parents didn't have the opportunity to go to college. My dad grew up during the Depression, and he very, very much wanted to go to college. So much so that my grandmother said that when she told him they couldn't afford to send him to college, she said he really broke down in tears. He really wanted so much to get that education. My mother did go to business college for a couple of years, but education was really important to them. And they really wanted my sister as well as myself to go to school. And so I always thought I would go to college. It really wasn't something that I ever doubted I would do. My sister did not, but I did, and I always wanted to.
Did you have a long-term plan to go to law school?
Law school is always something I really thought seriously about. When I was in high school, I was a high school debater. When I went to college, I did not debate my first 2 years, but I did engage in intercollegiate debate my second 2 years, and that's a form of advocacy. Mm-hmm. I majored in political science, which got me obviously interested in law as well. And one of the best courses I had as taking political science at Loyola was a course on constitutional law taught by a Jesuit priest who had gotten an advanced law degree from the University of Michigan. And he taught the course very much like a law school course, and I found that to be really, really interesting. And he's an interesting character because one day I was talking to a friend of mine. I had been admitted to both Northwestern and the University of Michigan. And he overheard our conversation, and he said, "Did I hear you say you got admitted to the University of Michigan?" And I said, "Yes." And he basically told me I really didn't have a choice. Between those two schools, I should go to the University of Michigan, and I did.
Okay. And when did you attend the University of Michigan?
From 1967 to 1970, which is probably most significant in terms of that period of time because that was during the Vietnam War.
And the draft was still?
And the draft was very much still a prevalent way of getting individuals into the military service.
And how did the draft affect your law school experience?
It affected in a few different ways. We started out with a class of, I'm going to say, somewhere between 175 and maybe 225 first-year students. But because the draft was ongoing, by the time we graduated, I think our class size was probably down to 125 people.
Wow.
And I remember quite vividly that was also when they started the lottery, and all of us who were staying in the law school dormitory, which was called the Lawyers Club, I remember we all went down to watch the one television set that was available as the dates were being pulled out and people were getting their lottery number, and how we commiserated with our classmates who ended up getting the first few numbers chosen, which meant that inevitably they would be drafted in support of the war. And some of them, sadly, were killed during the war, even while we were all still in law school.
And did you have a roommate that was drafted?
Yeah, I did, actually. My second year of law school, my roommate left at the end of the first semester of the second year because he got drafted into the military. But we've remained close friends. I was the best man at their wedding several years later, and we continue to see each other. We've had a tradition now for over 25 years of getting together on Labor Day weekend, along with another good friend who also got drafted and whose wife I had to transport from the law school to her family house with all their furniture. And the war, I think, brought us closer in certain respects over the years. Not at that time, obviously. It split us apart, but it kept us really close.
Did you get drafted while you were in law school?
Not when I was in law school. I was very fortunate that I graduated without being drafted. And immediately after law school, I got a clerkship with a justice on the Supreme Court of Illinois named Walter Schaefer, who at the time was considered to be, along with Roger Traynor, one of the two best Supreme Court justices in the entire country. And while I was doing the clerkship after that first year of law school, I did get a draft notice. And the judge wrote a letter to the local draft board indicating the role that I played and why it was important for me to continue in that role. And so initially the draft board deferred the notice that I got. And then they realized a few months later that that was a mistake and that legally they couldn't do that. And so then I got a second draft notice while I was still clerking, and that's when I enlisted in the Navy JAG Corps.
So you really began your legal practice career in the JAG Corps.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
What kind of things did you, well, first of all, tell us where you got stationed.
Well, initially, of course, a basic training in Navy Justice School. Those took place in Newport, Rhode Island, which was just an absolutely wonderful place to be. And then I got my orders, and it said that I was going to be stationed in Memphis, Tennessee. And I didn't realize that there was a Navy base in Memphis, Tennessee. I always thought they would be on the coasts one way or the other, but it turned out that at that time the station was in Millington, and it was the Chief of Naval Air Technical Training. And so I ended up being stationed in Millington, Tennessee.
Wow. And so what sort of legal things did you do while you were there?
We did a lot of different things. We had 4 different areas in which most of us practiced. We typically started, and I did as well, as defense counsel. Most of the charges were relatively minor. A lot of soldiers, or sailors rather, would go on leave without authorization, and we had to defend those. But we also gave legal advice to the enlisted personnel, because sometimes people would try to victimize them, and we would have to tell them what their legal rights would be. I also served on the admiral staff. The chief commanding officer of the base was an admiral, and we advised the admiral on various aspects of his job. And then finally, I was a prosecutor and prosecuted people who had violated some of the provisions of the Uniform Military Code of Justice.
So how long were you in that particular position?
About 14 months.
And at that point you decided to teach. How did you come to the decision to teach, and how did you manage to get the opportunity to teach?
Yeah, well, I was actually interested in becoming a teacher when I was still in law school, and had been encouraged actually by my faculty advisor, Professor Douglas Kahn, to think about teaching as a career. And so I did interview with a couple law schools while I was in my 3rd year. But I thought it would be better if I got away from law school, did a little bit of practice before I would go into teaching. Then, after I had been in the Navy for the period of time that I mentioned, about 14 months, the Navy had a program that allowed JAG officers who had full-time jobs at a law school to be discharged early in order to pursue that opportunity. And I interviewed both at the University of Illinois and at the University of Tennessee. And the University of Tennessee made me an offer. I let the Navy know about that offer, and they allowed me to go and take up that job. And I'm very glad they did.
So you moved to Knoxville.
Yeah.
And that would have been what year?
1972, and it's funny you mentioned Knoxville, because when I got the call from the dean at the time, it was Ken Penniger. He invited me to come for an interview, and I said, "Oh yeah, you're the law school in Nashville, right?"
Yeah.
He said, no, we're in Knoxville," and that was the first time I realized I had made a terrible mistake.
Okay, well, apparently not too offensive.
No, apparently not.
Okay. All right, so you came to the law school in 1972. Now, how long, you're retired now, is that right?
I am, yeah.
How long did you actually full-time teach?
For 43 years.
Wow. And what primary courses did you teach primarily?
It's funny because when I was hired, I was originally hired to teach property law and labor law. And I really didn't know too much about either other than what I had learned in law school. But eventually, I ended up focusing on civil procedure, conflicts of law I picked up after one of the faculty members, Professor E.O. Overton, retired. Federal courts was another course. And then for the last maybe 10 years or more, well, probably more than 10 years, I ended up teaching a course on civil rights actions, which was something that fit into a major research effort that I undertook with another faculty member, Professor Joseph Cook. He asked me in 1979-ish if I would be willing to co-author with him a multi-volume treatise on civil rights actions. And so it's natural then to take up that as a course that I would teach as well.
Tell us a little bit about that. How many volumes are in that set?
Currently, we have authored 5 volumes in that set. We originally came out with 3 volumes. I think that was in 1983 that the first 3 volumes came out. And then we came out with a 4th volume in 85 and then the 5th volume in 87. And it covers the gamut from the Reconstruction civil rights statutes. Most people think of the most prominent one, which is Section 1983 actions. But then the later 2 volumes dealt with the more modern civil rights statutes, things like the Equal Pay Act, Title VII, age discrimination, and all those statutes that were enacted in the period of time, starting with probably the 63 Equal Pay Act and all the way to the present.
So it was first published in 1983?
Yeah.
And then how have you kept it updated? What's that process been?
Yeah, well, we update it twice a year, which means going through the advance sheets, identifying cases that are relevant to the treatise and the chapters, and that's just a constant, everyday kind of a process that we've done now for, well, since 1983, quite a while.
Okay. You also had did some work for the Supreme Court on. Tell us about that.
Yeah, in about 1975, I was asked by the Supreme Court if I would serve as reporter to the Tennessee Supreme Court Commission on Civil Rules. The state Supreme Court had reached the decision that we needed to modernize the law of appellate procedure in Tennessee, and we really did.
Were there rules of appellate procedure at that time?
Well, no, not really. There were statutes that were scattered all over the Tennessee Code. There were judicial decisions that dealt with rules of appellate procedure. And it had been very well documented in Tennessee that an incredible number of cases were being decided on appeal, not on the basis of the merits of the underlying legal dispute, but they were being decided on the basis of technical matters of appellate procedure. And the court decided that that was inappropriate, and it really was. And so the whole idea behind the project was to simplify, modernize, and bring together in one spot some kind of a coherent system of appellate procedure in the state of Tennessee. So we started the project in 1975. There was a commission that had practicing attorneys from all across the state, urban, rural, all of whom really had a civil practice. And so we focused initially on just doing rules that would govern civil appeals, and later on the court sought the advice of people like Sissy Daughtry, Judge Daughtry, and others to make the changes that would be necessary to deal with criminal appeals. And we would meet in Nashville. I, as the reporter, would identify a particular area. I would draft a proposed rule. I would typically circulate a memorandum which would have copies of rules dealing with that subject area from other states, so that the committee had an idea of different ways that the rule could be formulated. We would meet, the rules would be modified, and we did that process, and it lasted about 3 years before we finally submitted to the court the proposed Tennessee Rules of Appellate Procedure.
And those became effective and...
They became effective July 1st, 1979.
Wow. And when you read the rules in the book, there are comments. Where'd those comments come from?
The comments basically were things that I wrote. And again, the commission looked at them, and if there were some suggestions made, I obviously would revise them. But most everything in the original version of the rules, they've been amended in some respects since then.
Right.
But pretty much everything in the original rules and the comments were things that, with the assistance of the commission, I helped draft.
Mm-hmm. And the court still cites those.
Yep.
As we've learned recently.
Right.
Yeah.
Still in effect.
Okay, so while you were at the law school during that 43 years, you didn't just teach and just work for the Supreme Court and just work on the Civil Rights Treatise. What else did you do?
Taught, obviously.
Yeah, well, but you became an associate dean at some point.
Oh, yeah. Dick Warts asked me if I'd be willing to serve as Associate Dean of Academic Affairs. And when Dick asked me to do it, I said, sure, and how long do you want me to do it? And he said, for 2 years. And I said, all right. It had been a position that had been rotated. Professor Patrick Hardin had been the Associate Dean for a while. Professor Joseph Cook had been the Associate Dean for a while. But most of them did it, like Dick asked me to do it, for a 2-year period of time. And I said that would be fine. But then at the end of my first year as the Associate Dean, Dean of Students Mary Jo Hoover told Dick Warts that she was going to retire at the end of the next year. And I was pretty confident that Dick did not want to have to hire 2 new deans in the same year, and I thought that meant probably I'd have to be the Associate Dean for a 3rd year. And indeed, he did ask me to do it for a 3rd year, and I agreed. And then, of course, in that year, Dick came to tell me that he decided that he would retire as dean the next year. And I thought that probably meant that the new dean would want some continuity and might well want me to stay in the job, at least for a year. And we hired Tom Galligan as the dean, and I, at the end of the first year, told Tom that he could have anybody he wanted to as his associate dean. And he asked me to stay in that position, which I did during the entire 8 years that Tom was dean of the law school.
And then when Tom Galligan left the UT Law School, what did you do?
Well, then I became the interim dean of the College of Law for 2 years. And it was an interesting experience. The transition from being a faculty member to being the associate dean was a transition, to be sure. Faculty members tend to be very autonomous. They pretty much can control their own schedule. But when I became Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, that changed in a lot of ways. One way in which it changed is, of course, now you're responsible to a certain extent for everything that's going on in the law school, because Tom really did include me in absolutely everything that was going on. And so you're working with the admissions people, you're working with the financial aid people, you're dealing with the career services individual, the business office. And that's much more, all that is much more of a team effort, as opposed to the more individualistic kind of work that I think most faculty members are accustomed to. And then when I became dean, it also gave me, again, a different view, because now I had much greater responsibility working with the university central administration, which is something that typically the dean does almost exclusively. Not entirely. I mean, I did do some work when Tom was out of town and things like that, but it was a very interesting experience, one that I'd never would have imagined when I started a career in legal education that I would ever end up in an academic administrative position It never crossed my mind. And when Dick asked me to do it for 2 years, I thought that was going to be it. 2 years, and it ended up being in total 13 years.
Wow. Well, now, while you were doing all these things that we've already talked about, you also took on some responsibility for one of the intercollegiate teams.
Yeah, Joe Cook asked me if I would work with him on the National Moot Court team. And the reason he asked me is that the team was doing very, very well in terms of their oral arguments. But typically, they would be eliminated from the competition because their brief scores were not as good as they needed to be in order to advance. So Joe asked me if I'd be willing to work primarily, not exclusively, but if I'd work primarily with the National Moot Court team in order to help them write briefs that would be more competitive than they had been in the past, and I agreed to do it. In retrospect, I probably should have stopped at the end of the first year because that team ended up winning the national championship, and that team wrote the best brief in the country on the particular side that they briefed that year. But I stayed on and have done it and still am doing it. Even though I'm officially retired, I still am faculty advisor to the National Moot Court team. And
you've had to do it because of COVID virtually this last year.
Yeah, last
2020.
Last year was totally virtual. Both the regional and the team did extremely well. They won the regional competition. They then qualified for the national finals, which normally would be held in New York City, but again, because of the COVID situation, we had to do that virtually. But they did very well. They advanced to the round of 8, and when you consider the fact that typically anywhere from 120 to 150 schools participate in the competition, being in the top 8 is pretty impressive.
Wow. So during the time that you worked at the University of Tennessee Law School, what changes did you notice in the makeup of the student body and the attitudes of the student body?
Yeah, there were a lot of changes. When I came in 1972, the school was expanding dramatically. I think there had been a total of maybe 6 faculty members prior to 1971, the year before I came. And that year, the law school hired, I think, 6 individuals. My year, another 6 individuals. So just in the span of 2 years, the size of the faculty tripled. And then we hired more people again the following year. And the size of the student body grew dramatically. I think at its height, we probably had over 500 students in the College of Law. And anybody who remembers the old building in which we were in will also remember how when class time changed and students had to go from one classroom to another, how it was a real struggle even to get down the hallways. And I remember teaching evidence courses with 125 students in them. Those numbers obviously now have gone down. Law school now, I think, is more in the neighborhood of 125, 150 students. But the other change was when I started, the law school student body population was predominantly male. There were very, very few women in law school. And that changed to the point where in some years, the number of women in a particular class exceeded the number of men in a particular class. There were also changes in the racial composition of the law school. Beginning in the mid-'70s, late '70s, we had African American students who were coming to the law school. That has only increased over time. More diverse students today than ever before. The last few years when I was teaching, it was a noticeable change, or increase rather, in the number of Hispanic students coming to the school. And so to that extent, it's a much more diverse community than it certainly was when I started. And the same is true to a certain extent of the faculty. I mean, when I started, we were basically all white males. I think one of the people that was hired with me was the first female that was ever hired. And I think Professor Marty Black, who was hired a couple years later, was the first woman that was tenured on the College of Law faculty. Well, today, if you looked at the composition of the faculty, you'll see that it is more diverse, both in terms of gender composition and racial composition, certainly much more so than it was when I started to teach. And all that's, I think, for the good.
How so? How's it actually changed the day-to-day function?
Oh, I think it gives you people bring their life experiences to bear, and I think it makes a big difference. And you can, when you hear a student talk about what their life experience is, and informs you about how they may be thinking about legal issues in a way that maybe you wouldn't have thought about them before, and how maybe the law needs to accommodate itself to those changes and those attitudes. And I think it's just been all to the good.
In addition to all these things we've talked about, have you also, from time to time, assisted local lawyers with their cases or projects?
Yeah, I would be called upon and have been called upon, especially if it was an area that I taught in, and sometimes areas that I didn't teach in. I did a fair amount of work for Foster Arnett, who turned out to be an incredibly generous person. Took a great interest even in my parents, and I remember when my dad was sick, and very sick, he sent flowers to my dad, and I did a fair amount of work for Foster and other people in town as well. And then when I started to write the treatise on civil rights actions, that in turn also led to people calling and asking if I would help them, or at least work with them on brief, one of which actually involved the University of Tennessee, which was a case that ended up going to the Supreme Court of the United States, University of Tennessee versus Elliott. And I was basically of counsel on the brief for that particular case.
Wow. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your career in law?
20. I really enjoy teaching. I think the hardest thing about doing the administrative work was that I did continue to teach. And all the deans at the law school always have. The dean and the associate dean for academic affairs, those of us who have faculty appointments, we always have continued to teach, but it's at a half load. So you're only teaching one course a semester rather than 2 courses. But I've always loved to teach. And so the disadvantages of being an administrator was the fact that I didn't have as much time in the classroom with the students. The advantages were you could make things happen. And when you saw a problem, you could do something about it. And that was the rewarding aspect of being in the administrative side of the law school.
Do you have any special advice for young lawyers of today?
Oh boy. I think what I would tell young lawyers today is that they can make a difference. That their legal training is something that allows them to really help people and institutions do good things. And I would hope that they would realize how important it is to do that as part of their overall commitment to a more just civil society.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome.